Kidnapped is an historical fiction adventure novel by Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson, written as a boys' novel, and first published in the magazine Young Folks from May to July 1886. The novel has attracted the praise and admiration of writers as diverse as Henry James, Jorge Luis Borges, and Hilary Mantel. A sequel, Catriona, was published in 1893. Kidnapped is set around 18th-century Scottish events, notably the Appin Murder, which occurred near Ballachulish in 1752 in the aftermath of the Jacobite Rising of 1745. Many of the characters were real people, including one of the principals, Breck Stewart. The political situation of the time is portrayed from multiple viewpoints, and the Scottish Highlanders are treated sympathetically. Plot summary. The full title of the book gives away major parts of the plot and creates the false impression that the novel is autobiographical. It is Kidnapped, being memoirs of the adventures of David Balfour in the year 1751, how he was kidnapped and cast away, his sufferings in a desert isle, his journey in the wild Highlands, his acquaintance with Breck Stewart and other notorious Highland Jacobites, with all that he suffered at the hands of his uncle, Ebenezer Balfour of Shawes, falsely so-called, written by himself and now set forth by Robert Louis Stevenson. The central character and narrator is 17-year-old David Balfour. His parents have recently died, and he is out to make his way in the world. He is given a letter by the Minister of ISNI, Mr. Campbell, to be delivered to the House of Shawes in Cramond, where David's uncle, Ebenezer Balfour, lives. On his journey, David asks many people where the House of Shawes is, and all of them speak of it darkly as a place of fear and evil. David arrives at the ominous House of Shawes and is confronted by his paranoid uncle Ebenezer, who is armed with a blunderbuss. His uncle is also miserly, living on porridge and small ale, and the House of Shawes itself is partially unfinished and somewhat ruinous. David is allowed to stay and soon discovers evidence that his father may have been older than his uncle, thus making David the rightful heir to the estate. Ebenezer asks David to get a chest from the top of a tower in the house, but refuses to provide a lamp or candle. David is forced to scale the stairs in the dark and realizes that not only is the tower unfinished in some places, but the steps simply end abruptly and fall into an abyss. David concludes that his uncle intended for him to have an accident so as not to have to give over his nephew's inheritance. David confronts his uncle, who promises to tell David the whole story of his father the next morning. A ship's cabin boy, Ransom, arrives the next day and tells Ebenezer that Captain Hoseason of the brig Covent needs to meet him to discuss business. Ebenezer takes David to appear on the Firth of Forth, where Hoseason awaits, and David makes the mistake of leaving his uncle alone with the captain while he visits the shore with Ransom. Hoseason later offers to take them on board the brig briefly, and David complies, only to see his uncle returning to shore alone in a skiff. David is then immediately struck senseless. David awakens, bound hand and foot, in the hold of the ship. He becomes weak and sick, and one of the Covenant's officers, Mr. Rick, convinces Hoseason to move David up to the forecastle. Mr. Schwan, a mate on the ship, finally takes his routine abuse of Ransom too far and murders the unfortunate youth. David is repulsed at the crew's behavior and learns that the captain plans to sell him into slavery in the Carolinas. David becomes the slain cabin boy's replacement, and the ship encounters contrary winds which drive her back towards Scotland. Fogbound near the Hebrides, they strike a small boat. All of the small boat's crew are killed except one man, Breck Stewart, who is brought on board and offers Hoseason a large sum of money to drop him off on the mainland. David later overhears the crew plotting to kill and take all all his money. David and Alan barricade themselves in the roundhouse, where Alan kills the murderous Schwan, and David wounds Hoseason. 5 of the crew members are killed outright, and the rest refuse to continue fighting. Alan is a Jacobite who supports the claim of the House of Stuart to the throne of Scotland. He is initially suspicious of the pro-Whig David, who is also loyal to King George II. Still, the young man has given a good account of himself in the fighting and impresses the veteran soldier. Hoseason has no choice but to give Alan and David passage back to the mainland. David tells his tale to Alan, who in turn states that his birthplace, Appin, is under the tyrannical administration of Colin Roy of Glenery, the king's factor and a Campbell. Alan vows that should he find the Red Fox, he will kill him. The Covenant tries to negotiate a difficult channel without a proper charter pilot, and is soon driven aground on the notorious Torrin Rocks. David and Alan are separated in the confusion, with David being washed ashore on the Isle of Erraid, near Mull, while Alan and the surviving crew row to safety on that same island. David spends a few days alone in the wild before getting his bearings. David learns that his new friend has survived, and David has 2 encounters with beggarly guides, one who attempts to stab him with a knife, and another who is blind but an excellent shot with a pistol. David soon reaches Torresey, where he is ferried across the river, receives further instructions from Alan's friend Neil Roy McCrobb, and later meets a catechist who takes the lad to the mainland. As he continues his journey, David encounters none other than the Red Fox himself, who is accompanied by a lawyer, a servant, and a sheriff's officer. When David stops the Campbell man to ask him for directions, a hidden sniper kills the king's hated agent. David is denounced as a conspirator and flees for his life, but by chance reunites with Alan. The youth believes Alan is the assassin, but Alan denies responsibility. The pair flee from Redcoat's search parties until they reach James of the Glens, whose family has heard of the murder, is burying the hidden store of weapons, and is burning papers that could incriminate them. James tells the travelers he will have no choice but to paper them, but provides them with weapons and food for their journey south, and David with a change of clothes. Alan and David then begin the flight through the heather, hiding from government soldiers by day. As the trek drains David's strength, his health rapidly deteriorates by the time they are set upon by wild Highlanders who are sentries for Clooney MacPherson, an outlaw chief in hiding. The lad is barely conscious. Alan convinces Clooney to give them shelter. The Highland chieftain is offended when David covenantly refuses to play cards but defers to the respected Alan's opinion of the lad. David is tended by a Highland doctor and soon recovers, though in the meantime Alan loses all of their money at cards with Clooney, only for Clooney to give it back when David practically begs for it. When David and Alan resume the flight in cold and rainy weather, David becomes ill again and nurses a childish anger against Alan over the affront of having to beg for the money. Alan patiently tries to help the sulking David for several days, but he finally gives in to his own pride and begins taunting him. David forces a showdown with swords by insulting Alan's courage and loyalty, but Alan cannot bring himself to fight him. David, now sick in the extreme, at last feels contrition and realizes a plea for help can do what an apology will not mend the rift between them. Alan carries David on his back down the burn to reach the nearest house, fortuitously that of a McLaren, Duncan Dhu, who is both an ally of the Stuarts and a skilled piper. David is bedridden and given a doctor's care, while Alan hides nearby, visiting after dark. During David's nearly month-long recuperation, he is visited by many curious but loyal neighbors in the region and by a foe of Alan's, Rob O'Noig, the son of Rob Roy MacGregor and a wanted outlaw. Alan and Robin nearly fight a duel, but Duncan persuades them to leave the contest to bagpipes. Both play brilliantly, but Alan admits Robin is the better piper, so the quarrel is resolved. Alan and David prepare to leave the Highlands and return to David's country. In one of the most humorous passages in the book, Alan convinces an innkeeper's daughter from Limekilns that David is a dying young Jacobite nobleman, despite David's objections, and she ferries them across the Firth of Forth. There they meet a lawyer of David's uncles, Mr. Rankeeler, who agrees to help David receive his inheritance. Rankeeler explains that David's father and uncle had once quarreled over a woman, David's mother, and the older Balfour had married her, informally giving the estate to his brother while living as an impoverished schoolteacher with his wife. This agreement had lapsed with his death. David and the lawyer hide in bushes outside Ebenezer's house while Alan speaks to him, claiming to be a man who found David nearly dead after the wreck of the Covent and says he is representing folk holding him captive in the Hebrides. He asks David's uncle whether Alan should kill David or keep him. The uncle flatly denies Alan's statement that David had been kidnapped, but eventually admits that he paid Hoseason £20 to take David to Carolina. David and Rankeeler then emerge from the hiding places and speak with Ebenezer in the kitchen, eventually agreeing that David will be provided 2/3 of the estate's income for as long as his uncle lives. The novel ends with David and Alan's parting ways. Alan returns to France, and David goes to a bank to settle his money. At one point in the book, a reference is made to David's eventually studying at the University of Leiden, a fairly common practice for young Scottish gentry seeking a law career in the 18th century. Characters. David Balfour is accused of being an accomplice in the Appin murder, a real-life murder. The characters of Alan Breck Stewart, Colin Roy Campbell, James Stewart, Clooney Macpherson, and Rob O'Ig McGregor were real people. Shaw's David Balfour, honest 17-year-old who heads out on his own after his father dies. His mother had died earlier. David is unaware that he is heir to an estate, the House of Shaws. Although David is a lowland Scot, he could be any boy anywhere embarking on a journey from youth to manhood. Ebenezer Balfour, David's devious uncle. Ebenezer cheated David's father out of the House of Shaws. He first tries to murder David. When that scheme fails, he arranges to have him kidnapped and sold into slavery. Alexander Balfour, David's father, disinherited by his younger brother Ebenezer Balfour. Mr. Campbell, kind minister of Essendine who helps David at the beginning of his journey. At sea in the Hebrides, Elias Hoseason, captain of the Covenant. He buys David from Ebenezer in hopes of selling him into slavery at a profit. Mr. Schwan, first officer under Captain Hoseason. When he drinks, he is extremely cruel. Mr. Rigg, second officer under Captain Hoseason. Ransom, abused cabin boy whom Hoseason uses to help ensnare David in the kidnap scheme. Old man and his wife, poor but generous residents of the island of Mull who give David food, drink, and valuable information, then allow him to rest in the hut. Guide, island of Mull resident who lodges David for 5 shillings and agrees to guide him to Torresey. Hector McLean, island of Mull resident who changes a guinea into shillings so that David can pay the guide. Duncan Mackay, blind man who guides David through part of the island of Mull. In spite of his blindness, he knows every rock and bush on the island. He is a dangerous man who carries a pistol and can shoot by ear. However, David pretends to have a pistol too, and thereby avoids trouble with him. Neil Roy Macro, friend of Alan's and skipper of a ferry that takes David from Torresey to mainland Scotland. Macro gives David directions for how to assemble with Stewart. Island of Mull innkeeper, man who befriends David and lodges him at Torresey. In the Highlands, Alan Breck Stewart, a daring and foolhardy Highlander who has gone into exile in France and wears a French uniform. He is tasked with collecting funds for the exiled Jacobite leadership from the clans previously in rebellion against the Hanoverian crown. He becomes friends with David and helps him survive when both are hunted by soldiers through the wilderness. Stewart is based on a real-life Jacobite rebel of the same name. Breck is a nickname referring to pockmarking on his face. Colin Roy Campbell, also known as the Red Fox, Scotsman loyal to the Hanoverian crown. He acts as the king's agent in two Highland counties, Appin and Murder. His job is to collect taxes and claim for the crown Scottish lands forfeited by pro-Jacobite clans. He is shot dead while talking with David. Alan is accused as the murderer and David as his accomplice. Colin Campbell was a real-life royal official who was shot dead near Ballachulish. His case became known as the Appin Murder. James of the Glen, Highland chieftain who lost his lands to the Hanoverian crown. He is the head of the Stewart clan to which Alan belongs. James is based on a real-life Scotsman of the same name who was accused of being an accomplice and aiding and abetting the murder of Colin Campbell. He was tried at Inverary, found guilty and hanged near Ballachulish November 8, 1752. Mrs. Stewart, wife of James Stewart. She treats David kindly and says she will always remember him. Clooney Macpherson, another chieftain who lost his lands, chief of Clan Vorich. As a Jacobite rebel, he is in exile from Hanoverian rule and lives in a hideout near Ben Alder. Rob O'Nig, son of Rob Roy MacGregor, a famous Highland outlaw, Henderland evangelist who becomes friends with David in the Highlands and provides him valuable information about the region. He is moderate and reasonable in carrying out his mission. Edinburgh Queen's Ferry innkeeper, man who provides some information about Ebenezer Balfour's background. Mr. Rankeeler, lawyer who helps David settle legal matters with his uncle. Major themes: the solid historical and environmental background, and the realism with which the physical hardship suffered by Breck and David is described, give the novel an immediacy which perhaps explains its hold on some readers, given the simple narrative line and spare plotting. Indeed, plot only takes a dominant role at the beginning and end of the novel, while the heart of it lies in what Henry James described as the really excellent chapters of The Flight in the Heather. Some of the Scottish dialogue may be hard-going for non-Scots readers, though Stevenson himself admitted that he had applied only a smattering so as not to tax the inner ear of non-Scots. Kidnapped also shows the importance of friendship and loyalty, mostly between David and Breck. Literary significance and criticism. Kidnapped was well received and sold well while Stevenson was alive, but after his death many viewed it with skepticism, seeing it as simply a boys' novel. By the mid-20th century, however, it had regained critical approval and study. It presents, however, the Jacobite version of the Appin Murder and is not historically accurate. The sequel, Catriona, was written while Stevenson was living on Samoa. Its theme is largely romantic and less adventurous. Adaptations. The novel has been adapted a number of times, and in multiple media. The Robert Louis Stevenson website maintains a complete list of derivative works. Film and television versions were made in 1938, 1948, 1960, 1971, Kidnapped 1978, 1986, 1995 and 2005. Alan Grant wrote and Cam Kennedy illustrated a 2007 graphic novel adaptation. Translations of the graphic novel were also published in Lowland Scots and Scots Gaelic. Marvel Illustrated published a comic book version in 2007-2008 by Roy Thomas and Mario Gully, who had previously adapted Treasure Island. James Annesley case, beginning with some of the earliest reviews of Kidnapped in 1886. It has been thought the novel was structured after the true story of James Annesley, a presumptive heir to 5 aristocratic titles who was kidnapped at the age of 12 by his uncle Richard and shipped from Dublin to America in 1728. He managed to escape after 13 years and returned to reclaim his birthright from his uncle in one of the longest courtroom dramas of its time. As Annesley biographer Eckert says, it is inconceivable that Stevenson, a voracious reader of legal history, was unfamiliar with the saga of James Annesley, which by the time of Kidnapped's publication in 1886 had already influenced 4 other 19th-century novels, most famously Sir Walter Scott's Guy Mannering and Charles Reade's The Wandering Heir.